Starting in the 16th century, we start to see a change in the way that monarchs started to operate in Europe. They move away from the traditional views that we've had of monarchy and towards a more absolute total control over the realms. And this kind of rule we call absolute monarchy or absolutism. The basic idea of absolutism is that in his or her realm, the monarch should have absolute total control over everything, over laws, over the economy, over religion. Everything in the state should be about the king and not anyone else. You might notice this is a change. In feudalism, the king was essentially a lord of a lot of land. Over time, since the Middle Ages, we've seen monarchs slowly absorb power, but this is really to a higher degree than we've seen before. The idea is pretty well articulated here by King James the Sixth and First, who we'll talk about later. He was a king of England who tried to really establish this idea that kings should have all the power. He wrote a whole book about it, and he articulates it here pretty well. The idea that to disobey a king is to disobey God. That the king should, it's nice that the king bounds his actions in law, but he's not bound to. That really everything the king does should be considered legitimate because he's the king. Part of this idea, too, was the idea of divine right. So where do kings get this power? Remember, in feudalism, they got their power from the contracts they made with the lords. They owned all this land, the lords watched the land for them, and so the kings had power. Now you've got this idea of divine right. Basically, the argument was made that because kings were born into their positions, it was God who chose the king. And therefore, to question the king is to question God. So it gives the ruler really this absolute religious authority here to rule. Why did this happen now? Why the early 16th through the 18th centuries? There's a lot of factors involved here that slowly allow kings to increase power. We've seen feudalism slowly decline since the High Middle Ages. At this point, a lot of European countries start to lose their serfs because agriculture becomes less important, and we move through that capitalist sort of business revolution. And with the lords declining, the kings sort of suck the power in that power vacuum. As cities grow, the middle class grows. And since the middle class doesn't live on farms, they don't pay taxes to their lords, they pay taxes to the king. That becomes a source of money and power for the king. You also saw rising nationalism since the end of the 100 Years' War, and especially in some of these conflicts in the Reformation, like the 30 Years' War. People don't think of themselves as belonging to a particular region or a lord. They think themselves as belonging to their nation. They think themselves as English or French or Russian. And so they turn towards their king, their national leader, for authority. As colonies expand and we have mercantilism as the sort of driving economic force, the monarchy gets more and more wealth. And since the Reformation, church authority starts to weaken. And it's going to be kings that absorb that religious authority. In Protestant countries, that often meant kings, chose what kind of churches would practice in their country, what their national church would be. And in Catholic countries, in response to the Reformation, a lot of kings will try and step in and make sure everyone is practicing the kind of Catholicism they want to see. Overall, all these conditions are going to lead to the monarchy to become more and more